Aim to conceive what a roar of the deafening shouts and the shrieks of thousands of men sound in your ears. Listen to that flash of steel on steel, weapon on armor, and the screaming of terrified war horses. The coughing, throat-smoking, metallic fragrance of the air is so acute. The soldiers can taste it in their tongue as they push and sink in a pool of mud and blood. And the scene, which yet sounds to you epic. Then hark back to the dark ages of the Middle Ages and scuff it underfoot why you could not live 10 minutes on a battlefield. Knights, castles, and kings? You know them like the back of the hand, eh? So you had better cling to your chain armor since we are going to write a new page in history about the Roman Empire. Wait a minute, Roman Empire? Is not that prior to my favorite medieval legends? I may nearly hear you reasoning. Yes, thou hast said so, but believe me and hearken. I am dropping the channel connection immediately below. So back to our subject now, which is medieval madness. Have we not already reached that hell? It was not only the bloody mess on the battlefield that ruined the army and devoured the soldiers. You dare not forget that even before they got there, the soldiers marched miles with their eyes bloodshot by sleeplessness and were hungry. Most certainly they must have been knocked about in small skirmishes on the roads as they headed to the Great War. What we term war was at times a pack of war one right after another without you even having a breath. Reading the dusty pages of the Wars of the Roses, we find that in 1471, the critical battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury were fought within the space of 3 weeks. And in the Hundred Years' War in 1346, the siege of Calais and half a dozen independent engagements kept the troops in the mud all a year. The Battle of Blanchetaque and Crécy were separated only by 2 days to recuperate. No, you have not much time to get ready to the next butching, and are busted physically and mentally, are you? Such simple movement between one place and the other might be a days-long torture. Thou must carve war supplies and food convoys with that huge torrent of people. Men and horses in thousands lost their lives in the cold, sickness, or hunger on the road, before even a glimpse of the enemy. Consider what the English army did at the Battle of Agincourt. They landed in August in France in the heat of summer, and were at the port of Harfleur till October. The infamous dysentery epidemic that had been ravaging the army since they left, caused by the so-called bloody flux, had decayed it inside and turned the ones who survived into ghosts by the time they got there. Feel that noise in your bones. The noise of a battlefield of the Middle Ages was such psychic torture which tore away the mind of a soldier. The hornblower must have been miles away at the lee of the leaders. This is why the troops who awaited death on the fighting side were almost certain to be unable to hear the charge horn. The foot soldiers seldom heard those commands and marched to their death, as historian Thomas Walsingham remarked, like a herd, simply following the steps of the fellow soldier beside them. In that market of life and death and the screams and shouts, it was impossible that anyone should hear the commander or the horn. Christine de Pizan, who wrote in the 14th century, recommended drowning the opponent not with weapons, but with noise. Attack in a manner that the ears, rather than the bodies of the opponent, get caught in the noise and chaos. Let the swarm of crossbows, the swarm of cannons, the swarm of trumpets come pouring down like a swarm of flies, and sewer up them thread by thread and needle by needle. When a commander was on the field and was advancing, his sole thought was to make his men arrive at the enemy closely interlocked like a wall of flesh. The men in arms would form themselves in columns of shoulder to shoulder deep, and move at a brisk step as they were part of one person. They would pause at intervals to reconstruct that human wall to ensure the ranks were not broken. They would not be madly rushing after the enemy. The task of the commander was to make his men come down on the enemy not exhausted, but with some strength remaining to struggle. At the moment of the distance being bridged, the foot soldiers would snap into place, and then with all their strength dash upon the enemy. In other cases, the other party would not wait at the point at which they were waiting. Unless one side fled in fear, that horrible crash of collision would be met, and men would begin tearing one another to shreds with all they can reach. Axes, swords, daggers, bare fists. Occasionally, that mental strain and the ear-shattering sound would cause the will of one side to crack, and the structure would fly apart. The awful psychological weight on these men must never be underrated. The vast majority of them were simply common people others were mere able-bodied peasants who were picked on the roads in the march. Both parties were stubborn, and the battle would take hours until one of them is tired. Consider the Battle of Towton in the year 1461. It lasted 10 hours in the midst of that dreadful snow show. Blood and snow played to mix. Even flight did not save. In the most part, it only put off death. The actual calamity began because one of the armies had their backs turned to make a runaway, and the victors launched a manhunt like hunters. A complete wall of death. Findings by archaeologist Dr. Timothy Sutherland are chilling to those who hear about them. Nearly 40% of the skeletons on the front lines were killed not by the hands of the enemy, but by being crushed to death as a result of the stamp of their own comrades in panic. Efforts to picture that mess, that hell of yours. Not only screams of the enemy, but also of your own comrades in the same line, whose breath you can feel. It is as though with the horror of that moment, most men would begin to howl like animals without the slightest conscious understanding. Your brain is boiling inside your helmet with your head cooking. You're not able to breathe, the air of the lungs will stick to your throat like a wet rag. Each time you move a step forward, you become a bit more of a panic victim. You lose your way. Your nostrils are full of your own sweat, and you are afraid of the other men at your elbow. Then, just as you are supposed to face the enemy, after you have been able to survive that hail of arrows, you fall forward in the mud, face down. Other people around you are as leaves fall. The people behind you chip at you callously to the ground with the impulse of that solid press. The very first thing you know is that your worst enemy turns out to be your brothers in arms. Others attempt to place you beneath their foot, not to fall, but they fall and fall on top of you as well. The people behind them are as doomed a collection of human dominoes. You are in the mud under those heavy boots and armor pressing on you on either side. You can do nothing to get up. You are gradually drowning in pain in the depths of only a few inches of mud and can no longer see the daylight. You are not able to move. You are not able to breathe. You are not able to scream and ask anybody to help you. And you hear the sounds of the bones breaking and the moans all around you. And you broke your arms and your ribs and your back. You have your head kicked and tossed about as a football in the middle. Thousands of feet of the earth are over your face. Here precisely was the fate of those poor soldiers in the Battle of Visby in 1361. The ones who had wounds on their bones with weapons had had those hits when they were lying on the ground, helplessly on their deathbeds. And at that very moment, all your uncovered parts of the body are a tempting prey to the foe. A huge gaping hole in the head. And it was the most lawless regulation of war. The head was the primary object. There was no accident about there being 27 out of 28 skulls which were investigated at Towton broken. Either they had no armor, or they had been thrown out of their heads in that tussle. This is verified in historical sources as well. It is the clearest kind of violence that was always inflicted on the head. According to the research by Dr. Kelly DeVries, the majority of the fatal blows fell directly down the top of the head or the neck. You have been dying to forget about those nice scenes in the movie where you swing the sword. You never had the opportunity in real life. You were so crowded on that you could not even raise your arm. That is why axes, spears, and maces, which were used in close range, had more effect on death than swords. There are soldiers who still maintained an upright position even after they died because of the pressure exerted by the crowd. A sword was wealth, an art that took years to perfect, and it only reflected in the nobility. Swords were merely a minor component of the weaponry on the battlefield, and to die by a rusty ancient scythe or to be gutted by a pitchfork with my head was no less real death than to be cut by an expensive sword. Other desperate men went to the extent of defying death using a sharpened shovel. The exterior of that helmet would become an oven of more than 43 degrees Celsius temperature within 20 minutes, as armor expert Dr. Alan Williams remarked. It is written in history that the French knights in the Battle of Mansoura did not die in the hands of the enemy, but they killed themselves by cooking and suffocating in their own armor. The same happened to the people who tried to escape at Towton. Some of them were shot in the back as they were away, and some drowned in rivers. The rivers were said to have run blood red some days, and when the war was over, the conquerors would buzz around the field like flies. They would plunder the wounded, the dead, what we